We often enjoy stories of heroes, characters who encounter incredible obstacles or go through many emotional conflicts that we as normal people go through, and triumph in the end to grow stronger, wiser, nobler. But what if the central character is not a hero, but a villain?
I can't keep doing this on my own. With these people.
You see, I had this thought a while ago about approaching a story where there is no clear indication of good, but there is an indication of evil. And two ideas came to mind: writing the villain's perspective or writing a character with no memory of themselves. So we as the reader would start to see the characters as either villains or know that they are the villains. I asked you guys which one was more interesting in a poll, and winning by a landslide is writing the villain's perspective was far more appealing of an idea. And here is why I think a story like that would be incredibly interesting. We are familiar with the story of the hero's journey, the protagonist triumphs over obstacles, but what happens when the central character of our narrative embodies darker traits? Manipulation, cruelty, or skewed sense of morality. Why might this type of story be interesting? Well, it's because a villain by nature offers layers of psychological depth that many hero characters don't. When we write our heroes in our stories, we often create a character who is good but fundamentally flawed. Their heart's in the right place, and maybe they do a few bad things here and there, but more than anything else, there is still a clear indication of a hero. So while this character may do one or two bad things or a few morally grey things, they are still ultimately a hero, and they become more of a hero by the end of the story. Well, when it comes to a villain, they cross that barrier. It's typical for villains to have a backstory that explains why they fell so low. Perhaps it was a lust for power, revenge, perhaps they lost someone they love or gave in to a certain fear, or perhaps were brainwashed to align themselves with some misunderstood ideals. Exploring these aspects gives us a better view of the uglier side of human ambition, obsession, or even survival. Stories such as ones in post-apocalyptic worlds where the heroes do terrible things, so you can only imagine what the villain does. So it's no mystery as to why a story like this would be interesting. When a villain takes center stage, the goal of the story shifts entirely. In a traditional hero-centric plot, we expect resolution. Good overcomes evil, but with a villain as the main character, the goal isn't necessarily redemption or even triumph. Instead, the story's objective could be to just understand what forces shape this character's descent, or to question whether society and circumstances are just as guilty in their creation. And when saying that, you can't help but think of, or at least I can't help but think of, the Joker movie, where we followed an antagonist from beginning to end, and from the beginning to the middle to the end, it was just horrible. We follow a character who doesn't do anything that is good. All we see is a character becoming more and more villainous, more and more selfish, seeking a gratification they perhaps think they deserve, for they see their ideals as greater than everybody else's. At least that's my opinion, I'm not getting into that. And we also get to explore other ideas, like, does the villain see themselves as the villain? I mean, many of the best villain-centered stories illustrate a character who genuinely believes they are the hero of their own narrative. As I mentioned earlier, I talked about in what makes a hero, and it's a character who isn't seeking their own happiness. In fact, many times they often feel they don't deserve it. They don't deserve to win, the power that comes with it, or the glory, whereas a villain does. And as a result, it creates this huge contrast where a character who doesn't want the attention, the heroism, the glory, and all that ends up getting it. And the one who does, the one who seeks their own happiness over others, well, they get a hollow sense of it through grasping power, but overall, they don't achieve what they sought out. So as you can imagine, the resolution between these two stories is very different. And now to the core of this video, which is how does a writer go about writing this kind of story? How does one make it enjoyable, entertaining? How do they pace it? Well, the first step is to fully humanize your villain. Perhaps you spend too much time writing villains and making them too two-dimensional, or making them so that the reader doesn't empathize with them too much. One must see their evil for what it is, and not try to understand them so much that we find ourselves rooting for them. If you do that, all you end up doing is creating an anti-hero, a character who does terrible things, but with good intentions. So if you want to make sure that your villain remains a villain from beginning to end, you got to make sure it's very clear to the reader that they are not a good person. And you're not going to try and humanize them to such an extent that you make them too good to be a villain. Then there is the tone of the story. A villain-centered story is often morally ambiguous, even darker in nature, to the point where your tone needs to fit. If you go for an upbeat tone or humorous tone, all you end up doing is creating a black comedy, and the overall message of this character being a villain is lost. So don't try and make them into a character that is too ridiculous to take serious. Otherwise, they're not really a villain. They're just really a cruel joke of a character. But by all means, try to get your reader to feel that sort of challenge. The challenge that comes with feeling conflicted about rooting for someone they know at heart is a destructive, dangerous individual. As far as structure goes, you could have a character who might be average or at least decent in the beginning, but then goes through an inciting incident that turns them into a villain, and they go down that path however you want it to be. Or you could start right away with the character being villainous and horrible and simply follow them from then on. That much is up to you, and otherwise the structure still very much fits any other structure that you want to use. A 3-act story structure will still feel very much the same way. A villain still has a goal, just like a hero does. So when pacing your story, it's not too different. It's merely the content and the presentation of the character that makes them the villain. But most importantly, the ending is not going to be what a reader expects out of a hero story. The villain could do something absolutely vile and sinister in the ending, and they may feel great about it, or they may feel hollow about it. However you want to go about it, it's still not going to be a happy ending of all things. Now, what are some downsides of writing such a story? Well, one of the biggest challenges is going to be your reader being alienated. Not everyone enjoys investing emotionally in a character who is ultimately a villain. It's not something that sits well with anybody, because trying to align themselves with a character in order to follow them or emotionally invest themselves in their journey and to only have them do terrible things, well, it's going to be very difficult for a reader to enjoy reading them. A reader doesn't even enjoy reading a hero who is boring or just obnoxious and annoying. So trying to make the villain somehow retain reader attention is going to be difficult. There's no redemptive arc in these kinds of stories. The readers might feel more than dissatisfied or even cheated, even by the ending which they know is coming. Moreover, a story that follows a villain too closely could slip into nihilism and overwhelming negativity that once more takes away from the story, and it leaves the reader with an empty feeling. That is the major downside of writing such a story, but there is one solution I feel that is worth mentioning. And this is probably the key in writing such a story and making it work. And this is just a theory because I have not written a novel that focuses on a villain. Certainly, I have had written stories where the antagonist is given the attention, you see it from their perspective, but only for a moment. I never did it for an entire novel. But I think the key in making this work is another aspect of the story that does help retain reader attention, a more positive aspect. And this can take many forms, but I think the best one and the easiest one to work with is to introduce another character who is a lot more positive, and one that reinforces that this is the villain that we are following in the story, but also helps us to be a bit more hopeful about what might happen next. So I'm thinking a character who is a friend or loved one of the antagonist. And this character must play a minimal role in the antagonist's journey, in the sense that when the antagonist is doing something, perhaps that darker side of their life isn't revealed to this positive character, or perhaps this positive character is ignorant to it. And the moments that this main character has with that positive aspect of the story could help retain reader attention, not only by giving us something positive to cling to, but also giving us a bit more nuance to the character as a whole. As I said earlier, we want to humanize our villain, and one of the ways to do this is to give them an interest or an attachment that isn't negative, that is positive, that gives us that sense of hope, that feeling that will keep us going throughout the story. What you decide to do with that positive aspect is up to you. There are many things you can do. One, for example, is you could have the villain's actions result in this positivity being taken away. Or you can have something else that doesn't have to do with the antagonist, the central character, take away this positive aspect, and then watch as the main character settles completely into this villainous personality and lifestyle. Again, both situations incredibly dark and snuffs out that last bit of hope, but is also fitting and in keeping with the kind of story that one would be writing if the villain was the central character. Your theme for the story can be anything. So what I'm trying to say here is you don't need to go into some deep thesis about society and justice or the human spirit in order to make this story impactful. You can just as well focus on the character itself and tell a good story. I think that's also a detractor from the story itself. It's kind of terrible to force intellectualism into a story that doesn't need it. And the next real question is where to go from here. Well, I recommend my video on heroes, where I talk about how heroes are dying out in our world, and certainly dying out in fiction.